Good morning, everyone. Quiche's always a really hard act to follow. So let me begin by thanking the organizers for the kind invitation to speak at this event. And with a caveat, I am a traditional scholar. I'm also a historian. So looking backwards comes more naturally than trying to look forwards. Second caveat, I've been asked to talk about China. And as anyone who follows the field, either in security or in economics terms, knows, it's incredibly difficult to talk about China today from a bigger picture point of view, as Peter Ho in his opening remarks encouraged us to think about. So I'm going to take the first stab at this and try to talk about China and its impacts on geopolitics in East Asia today and looking forwards from a bigger, sort of wider lens point of view. This means that I will not be doing what some of us call Zhongnanhainology. We will not be sort of trying to speculate about what's going on in the Chinese leadership and what China intends or does not intend, rather trying to put this in a bigger context and to think about some bigger picture questions that we might want to be considering at this point as we plan forward for the next decade or so. So, if I can get this to work, technology. Here we go. I need to resist the tradition of making 3 points. I'll make 4. In the little bit of time I have. The first one, very obvious to anybody who's based in China, in Asia, actually. Being based in Australia now, I sometimes feel I have to make this point, which is patently obvious to everybody else in the region. We're no longer talking about a rising China, or whether China might rise. China has risen. Now, there are things that this means and things that this does not yet mean, right? To say that China has risen means, as Quiche so eloquently put it, that China has redistributed, reshaped the world economy, regional politics, expectations of consumers, of manufacturers, innovators, and strategic planners. It's done all these things, right? What it does not necessarily mean yet is that China has taken over the world or the region. It does not yet mean that the United States has declined or disappeared, right? Or that other economic powerhouses, most notably Japan, have become irrelevant, right? It simply means that we've got this large second elephant in the room in East Asia that we must take into account of. You know, when you look around the bookshelves, or if you follow the news, we're often presented with this dichotomy, right? Are we faced with the Thucydides trap, right? Or are we looking forward into a future where we would have 新型大国关系, right? New model of major power relations, which is the preferred Chinese version. So are we going to have a power transition, very likely punctuated by war, major systemic war, right? Or might we have the prospect of moving towards a world order, which, as the Chinese would have it, is one that is mutually beneficial and has a new model by which great powers don't fight each other, but actually cooperate with each other for mutual benefits? The answer is, we're neither yet, right? Greek analogies may be helpful on some occasion, not particularly helpful in this one. Where we are now, which is why the art of forecasting is slightly difficult, is we're in that very awkward interregnum that Antonio Gramsci called, you know, that interregnum when the old is dying, but the new has yet to be born. And this is an interregnum which, to quote him loosely, is one where a variety of morbid symptoms appear, right? And it's those morbid, indefinite, VUCA or tuna sorts of symptoms that we're having to deal with. This murkiness is what makes that looking forward extremely awkward. And we're living now that interregnum. So what do we do about this? I'm sorry to say that most of what I'm going to talk about is rather old hat. My second point is that geopolitics in this new, exciting, massively connected, technology-driven world hasn't gone away. Right? Instead, it's reared its head in different new forms. Well, not entirely new. It's reared its head in a mix of old and new forms. Right? So a lot of this is going to sound familiar to you. What does geopolitics mean at heart? Right? It's that combination of power and geography, of course. Right? So at base, it's about location. Location, location, right? Where are you physically as a country, as a corporation, as a community in the world? Who's next to you, right? What does your periphery look like? What are the opportunities presented there for projections or exercises of your power? Geopolitics is also fundamentally, though, about what you make of connectivities and connections. This is where the characteristics of this increasingly technologically connected world, shrinking distances and making space and time, right, much less constraining on political activity becomes important. And what strikes me is that geopolitics has increasingly become that choice over which sets of connections, right, would we prioritize, right? It's not a zero-sum choice, it's about which would you prioritize, right? And this question is particularly important for East Asia, which is what I've been asked to talk about, for the following reason. The big geopolitical competition of our age is between two large competing connectivity projects, right? The first one is the one we know very well. We know so well, we know it so well, that we've stopped really thinking about this one so hard because it's become the common sense, right? This is the big Asia-Pacific project. Now, going back to geography, the Asia-Pacific is not a natural phenomenon. It's a deeply political construct. It's a deeply political construct into which significant amounts of resources, blood and treasure have been poured over the last 50, 60 years, right? It's that idea that our preeminent geographical connectivity should, for East Asia, look, oddly enough, eastwards, right, across the Pacific, at least towards the United States, if not the west coast of South America. This is the US PACOM symbol and map, which encapsulates that idea of the Asia-Pacific for us. This, for me, encapsulates the old which is dying, what Keisho talked about, right? That American-centric construct of what East Asia should mean and where East Asia should look, right? And this is a very typical sort of PACOM map that one finds. And what I like about it, that it shows you that one's got to cut up the traditional world map and fix two pieces together, which are usually at opposite sides of the map, to make up the Asia-Pacific, right? But this has, for much of the last 50, 60 years for us, been our geoeconomic and our geopolitical region of choice, right? It was also supposed to be the geoeconomic region of the future, right? With the idea of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, etc., which would bring this into a new generation. That's been halted for now, as we know. But I want to leave this first geopolitical imagination on the last note that is not purely, of course, an imagination. It's a region and it's a prioritized geopolitical construct that's been created in spite of the huge tyranny of distance. It is a truth that the United States has projected power across the Pacific in an immensely real way, right, in spite of the tyranny of distance involved. That amount of commitment of resources on a sustained scale and over a sustained amount of time is what is required, right, to make geopolitical reality of an imagined region. And that's quite an important point to keep in mind. It means two things. One, these geopolitical projects are difficult to create and to sustain. Two, they may not die away easily either, for reasons that I'll go on to talk about. Bear that in mind as we think about the second big competing geopolitical project of our time. Right? This I call the new Silk Routes. This is, of course, the Belt and Road, the One Belt, One Road initiative, whose name keeps changing. Now, this competing geopolitical project would have East Asia look the other way, westward, continental westward, instead of maritime eastward. Right? And as you all well know, because one can hardly get away from this vision at the moment, it is the revival of the traditional continental Silk Routes, moving westward from China towards Europe and the Middle East, and the introduction of a new, relatively new idea of the maritime equivalent of this, again, connecting the southern parts of China through Southeast Asia towards Africa and the Middle East and Europe as well. Here's the English version. This, I would argue, is the biggest geopolitical connectivity project of our time, not just because of the scope and breadth of its ambition, but also because of the vast mobilization of Chinese political resources that have now been poured into this project since about 2013, 2014. The idea naturally draws on China's location at the heart of Greater Asia. Right? It is only when you understand that it is China that draws together Central Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. Right? The idea that all roads will run from and to China, right? That this enterprise makes sense. So this is, of course, a fairly Sino-centric, but also Sino-fugal, if you want to put it. It's both centripetal and centrifugal project. There are very serious ramifications of this. In concrete terms, it is not just an act of imagination or political investment. There are concrete plans to connect vast peripheries which have not seriously been connected before by infrastructure. This is a South Asian component, featuring very significantly, if you look at just the bold lines, economic corridors between China and Pakistan, and also Bangladesh, China, India, and Myanmar. Obviously, another issue that lots of attention has been paid to, pipelines. The energy element of this is very significant. And for us in Southeast Asia, the parallel construction and reinvigoration of projects to connect mainland Southeast Asia, connect Southeast Asia through mainland Southeast Asia to China through a series of transport and other types of infrastructure corridors, including energy infrastructure. It would be tempting, when we look at these two sets of geopolitical projects, to think, as East Asians often do, and those of us in Southeast Asia often do, return to the old question, how do we have our cake and eat it too? Right? This is a question that small states, I will talk about small states, Kishore, small states think about, and this is the question that a region of transit, which is what Southeast Asia is, would traditionally think about. And it's not obvious that one could not have two distinct spheres of influence that we could play into, both eastward and westward. And this is indeed what this region has been trying to do over the last decade, at least, as it's become clear that China is going to pour its resources westward. I'd caution against that brand of slightly old-fashioned thinking for the following reason. Because of geopolitical connectivities. Peter Ho talked very usefully at the beginning about systems thinking, or complex systems thinking in planning for the future. And Peter knows I agree and I buy into that vision. And I'd even try to persuade you that one doesn't have to take a leap into new forms of technology or blockchains to get this idea, even in the intensely old-fashioned geopolitical realm. That idea of one part of the system being indelibly connected to other parts is fairly obvious. Right? This leads us to two considerations. When we think about geopolitics occurring in a complex system, two things come to dog us. One, feedback loops, negative and positive ones, and two, unintended consequences. Right? If we look at the intersections of that competition between those two big ideas, two illustrations serve to make this point fairly well, I think. First one, the reason why China, under President Xi Jinping, has chosen to go westwards, as well as holding its ground in the Eastern maritime sphere, it's in part because of the success of containment in the East Asian maritime sphere of Chinese ambitions, assertions, and activities. Right? So the pressure of having American containment on its eastern flank, backed up by the ring of American allies, spanning Japan, Korea in Northeast Asia, to Australia in the south, and a variety of security partners in Southeast Asia, was part of the strong reason for the argument domestically within the Chinese academic and policy communities from the early 2010s for this idea of marching westward, or in Chinese, xijin, right? To push out, to project power westward, where there was less resistance, where it was not obviously a neighborhood in which China was being geopolitically constrained and contained, right? It was inherent to this idea of the revival of the new Silk routes, right? Which subsequently got repackaged as a significantly economically driven enterprise. But the strategic underpinnings of this was to try and escape some of that intense security dilemma on the East. So these two arenas are connected. Of course, it coincided for China with a series of imperatives about having to develop its continental hinterland. We can come back to this issue in the discussion. My second example of the interconnectedness of things is this issue, again, very hot in the news this week, about China's development of its first overseas base in the port of Djibouti, joining other Western powers in developing maritime naval bases in that tiny kingdom. And part of the justification of this reasonably radical move for China, not radical for the United States or for France, or even less radical for Japan, to have a base in Djibouti, radical for China, right? A country with a government which has overtly and very clearly denigrated the use of overseas bases by great powers, and having, as a matter of principle, always said it would never do this. This radical move has been justified in large part because of China's growing role in things like anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, right? China's peacekeeping operations in Africa. Now, the interconnectedness of things part of this is that puzzle that's always struck some of us. Why take part as a responsible stakeholder in international anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, and not in the piracy-infested waters closer to home, in Southeast Asia, for example? Same reason as the one I put up before. The reason why China felt compelled, right, to take part in international anti-piracy operations as far away from maritime East Asia as possible was because of the security dilemmas imposed by efforts to contain China, especially in the maritime East Asian realm. Now that has generated this unintended consequence, right, of that base in Djibouti, or at least a good reason, right, for that underpinning that Chinese power projection further away from home. Now, the connected point about this is that this paradoxically resurrects fears, again, for the West and for others, about the string of pearls that, back in about 2003 to 2005, we were all talking about, right? That it would be inevitable that China would, over time, try to develop access to bases and facilities across the Indian Ocean in order to play a bigger role in securing the transit of its vital energy resources being shipped from the Middle East into China. Now, the Djibouti facility, of course, today is seen by many strategic commentators as one significant development in creating one pearl in that string. Obviously, there are other problems with other pearls in that string, which again we can talk about if we have time. So I'll conclude with this fourth part as briefly as I can. How then would we think about China's effects on geopolitics in East Asia going forward? I'd suggest that we've got three drivers that we want to think about. We're going to sort of, gaze forward and think about swans and elephants of whatever colors. The first driver, as you would expect, and as we all spend vast amounts of time focusing on, is what would be the response of other great powers, right? Again, in many discussions about China, we have a tendency to think about China as though it was just up to China. It had nothing to do with what anybody else was thinking or responding. And naturally, the response of great powers is one key thing we'd want to think about. And in that realm, as Kishore again has already so helpfully set the scene, what we traditionally begin with in thinking about is we think about the United States. What is the US going to do, right? Is it going to pursue a policy of engagement or a policy of containment? Has been the traditional question. What is Trump going to do? Who knows, right? And that obviously is a critical issue. I would add a second question to Kishore's immensely useful reminder that we may have to prepare for a time when the US is number 2. For East Asia, my black elephant of choice is the one that we don't think about often enough, is what is our plan B when the United States withdraws from the region, right? Or significantly draws down from the region. Right? And this could be in response to the rise of China, it could be in response to domestic exigencies at home, but what is our plan B when the United States withdraws? This is a black elephant because we don't think about this. The other question we want to think about when we think about the response of great powers to China's rise is we often think about containment. We think about conflictual scenarios. We think, when is the next big war coming between China and the United States? We think, when is Japan and China going to go to war over the Senkaku Islands or Diaoyutai, right? We think, well, will Russia reassert itself in the Far East to contain China? We think about all the conflictual scenarios. And I'd put on the table that we've got to think about the other set of scenarios, which are the cooperative ones, right? Do not forget that the biggest black swan, right, during the Cold War was 1972, and it was a cooperative one. It was when Nixon went to China and changed US policy 180 degrees. in executing that reconciliation with the People's Republic of China. So we may want to think about cooperative black elephants or swans probably, that we may not have thought about, right? For me, mine of the cooperative swan elephant of choice is a China-Japan condominium. It seems unlikely, but I think I can paint various scenarios in which that might be possible. That would change entirely the geopolitics of East Asia. It would take away a trope that we've never rethought, right? And it would undermine the reason entirely for the US being present in this region, to hold the ring between our two indigenous great powers. Driver number 2 is the response of other states. We think that only great powers matter, but of course, as Kishore and I well know, small states matter too. And this is where the complexities that Peter Ho talked about, even in the geopolitical realm, become troublesome, both for those of us trying to look ahead and for the great powers. It's because small states are not predictable, and small states can often have more choice and influence than great powers like. It really frustrates and irritates Washington and Beijing alike when small states in this part of the world exhibit a mind of their own. Right? There are many examples of this. I'll take this point about response of small states in 2 ways. First, to reiterate my point about that black elephant. Right? What we in Southeast Asia particularly have had a tendency to do, right, is to rely on that one key assumption that US forward deployment and defense commitments to this region will continue indefinitely when we do any strategic planning and defense acquisitions, etc. Singapore is less prone to that than a range of other Southeast Asian countries, but it is a Southeast Asian tendency to rely on this assumption. Take away that assumption, and again, my question is, what's our plan B? Right? That's not so clear. President Duterte in the Philippines illustrates this point very well. Southeast Asia is often characterized as flip-flopping, right, in the media, because of that inability to come up with a coherent idea of what's the plan B, if not the United States, right? My colleague at the Australian National University, Hugh White, has achieved fame and derision in equal measure for posing this very difficult question, right? Is there a middle ground, right? If we take away that assumption about the indefinite continuity of US commitment to the region, what do we do when we make a China choice? What does this choice look like? Does it simply mean that we turn over and have our tummies rubbed by China, right? Or is there some sort of path that would give small states more autonomy in that scenario? The second point about the choice of small states is that it's not so easy. We take for granted that small states will simply do what big powers want in geopolitics. This has never been the case historically, and it's not the case in the present. I'll give you 2 examples. China and its string of pearls. China has invested significant amounts of resources, both economic and especially political, on small peripheral countries in East Asia and South Asia over the last 30 years. It has devoted much more of those resources than we would have expected, given the relative strategic insignificance of these countries. Has it gotten its way? Right? Has it reaped the benefits of those resources? The unanimous answer in Beijing is no. It's incredibly frustrating. Right? Take first example, Myanmar. China's investment in Myanmar, particularly under the period of the military regime, was significant. Right? China was the only large player when it came to anything like infrastructure development, the building of shiny new facilities for government, dam building, etc. And what happens? Well, by 2011, the military regime decides that it's been becoming over-dependent on the Chinese. And that rationale was one of the key rationales that pushed the regime's decision to open up, to pursue some degree of reforms so that it could unlock other options of geopolitical support from the West, right? And this, as we saw in 2011, was what led to the postponement of the Mitsun Dam project, which was Myanmar's largest dam project, funded by the Chinese. So a slap in the face for Beijing, in spite of the decades of investment in this small, isolated country that still refused to give China face or to continue being solely dependent upon the Chinese. Sri Lanka is the other good example. Decades of investment at the behest of the Rajapaksa regime, right, which turned to China as a source of investment and assistance at a time of international isolation, at a time of increasing international derision and criticism of its human rights records. China puts in this investment. What happens? What looked like, a regime that had consolidated its power domestically lost power in 2000 and, I'm getting my years wrong, 14, 15? 15. The new Sirisena government is much less willing to rely solely upon the Chinese for developments of critical strategic infrastructure, such as the Hambantota port, which is meant to be critical to China's string of pearls strategy. So, not such an easy ride, right, for great powers in East and South Asia. The final driver we want to pay attention to is the sustainability of China's power, of course. And it is in this realm where we would find the other black elephant that we so rarely want to talk about, right? We often talk about slowdowns in China, right? We talk about growth rates, we worry about when the markets slow down, or when they take a dive temporarily. But the big black elephant is, of course, what if the whole thing unravels, right? This is why books like The Coming Collapse of China sell so well. And this is the black elephant that we'd want to think about as well. And there are good grounds for making these arguments. Official Chinese statistics indicate a range of between 170 to 180,000 mass protests in the country every year over a variety of issues, including local government accountability, corruption, anti-Japanese protests, anti-Vietnamese protests, yes, but critical issues about governance, right? And the worry, of course, is that these domestic drivers of instability might lead to the tendency to seek external adventurism or aggression, or to wage minor wars or campaigns in order to distract the domestic population's attention from these domestic difficulties. So we have a convergence here of two sets of drivers of instability when it comes to China's power, right? The sustainability of its domestic transition enterprise, coupled, right, with that temptation to seek distraction in external projection. So I leave you with these three drivers that may hopefully help inform our coming discussion about swans and elephants in East Asia's geopolitics. Thank you.